Bishop Mark?
Yes. Careful here.
Yeah. Sister Helen.
Sister Helen.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's Sister Helen. So good to see you. Oh, it's all right. Wow. Oh,
Yeah, he was a scripture. He baptized my niece with me.
Oh, okay, very good.
Yeah.
And knows your dad.
Yes, very well. Well, how great is that? Yeah. Hi, nice to meet you. Yes. Yes. I work at the hospital, so you know it's like. Oh no, I didn't see what I think just trying to get started. Yeah, I know how to go get my coffee. Really strong coffee. So, anyway. We got home, Brian was sick last night. So, what about you sick today? I think it's just from running the evening.
Do you just want to start, or do you want an
sure.
introduction?
Here's where I'm going to
Yeah.
be. Yeah, I think I've been introduced. Oh, Joan? Should I read the questions and respond, or? I guess maybe what I'll do is. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Bishop.
Once again, it's a pleasure to be with you. I hate to interrupt good conversations here, but also I am happy for this opportunity to share with you a little bit about our life on the border, perhaps, or some of the crazy things that I've written, or anything else you might have in mind. I venture in where fools and angels do not dare to go. But I'm so happy to be with you. I just have to mention, I'm so delighted. I just met one of my teachers from when I was here in 1985. Sister Helen Ralston, where are you, sister? What a pleasure to see you. She taught me a class there at St. John's. So anyhow, I'm at your disposal. They did send me or give me some questions that were submitted apparently, and if you don't have any, we can go to those, but let's begin with anything you might have on your mind.
There seems to be this controversy about the border over there.
Yeah.
I know you talked about staying away from politics. There's politics out there. There's politics out there, and I wonder your take on that.
Thank you. That's a big question. So one thing I like to say about that, when people say, why are you getting into politics? And believe me, I hear that a lot. I say, well, before it was politics, it was faith. you know, and it was Christianity, you know. So unfortunately, we have made partisan pretty much everything that that used to be just a question of living out our Christian faith, which, you know, is sad. But at the border, the church's involvement is that we remember Jesus saying something like, you know, they're radical things like, love your neighbor as yourself, that welcome the stranger. If somebody is not doesn't have clothing, clothe them. I know those are radical things. If you give them a drink of water in my name, you know, just doesn't seem like that should be so controversial. You know, we're not trying to, we know that the politicians have to decide how a border will be organized. We know in the church that there is a reason for political borders, but we also don't see them as absolute lines of demarcation and the highest good, you know, because there's a reality that's much deeper than a line that is drawn politically, and that is that human beings are brothers and sisters, you know, from the same Heavenly Father. And it seems like that is often forgotten today. It's so strange. It's almost like we're playing this you know, global game of Red Rover, Red Rover. You remember that game when you were growing up? You know, you join hands with, you form a line with people and let this person come over, and then you don't let them come over, right? And you try to keep them out, and it's like in the children's rules of games, we got to this side first, and so we can do what we want on this side, and it doesn't matter if you're trying to do the same thing we did, or our parents did, or our grandparents did, since we are a nation of immigrants. We got here and you can't. So it's so unfortunate. I guess I can go into it more deeply, but maybe I won't say too much because I want you to kind of zero in on areas of your interest or concern. I hope that begins to respond.
Yes, I understand. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
More specifics about your particular area of the border?
Yeah.
What's happening?
Happy to.
specifically?
Sure. So El Paso, as I mentioned at Mass, it is a point farthest west in Texas. If anybody else claims to be West Texas, they're only pretenders compared to us there in El Paso. And one thing I realized, I was a priest of Dallas, actually. I grew up in Wisconsin, then went to Dallas and entered the seminary and eventually joined the diocese and served there as a priest for 30 years. So 8 years ago, I was maybe the first United States bishop appointed to a diocese by Pope Francis, just like weeks after his being named. So he was just learning how to do it, and he probably made a mistake. But he appointed me there, and it was funny because after serving that long in Texas, I said, you know, I've seen most of the parts of the state of Texas. You'll never see the whole thing. It's big. But I've never been to West Texas. I've never been to El Paso. Someday I need to go there and visit. I've been visiting now for the last 8 years. But I had to look on the map. I had a general idea where it was. But I realized when I looked at the map that it is actually a point farther west than Santa Fe, New Mexico, and farther west than Denver, Texas kind of juts out there. But it shares a border with Mexico. I live probably, as the crow flies, mile and a half, something like that, from the border, really close. And our city is kind of a unique place. I mean, there are other border towns, but many of them have a distance from the border. We're like, we were a city, or a town at least, even before the border was drawn at the Rio Grande. And of course, originally there was like a river there that they called the Grand River. Now it's like a trickle that goes through there, Sometimes there's almost nothing left in the river by the time it gets to El Paso. And so our community has always been a place that's been very intertwined with the community on the other side. We are probably the largest binational community in the world, because we have, on the other side of the border is a place called Ciudad Juarez, and it's 1.5 million people. In El Paso, there are the county is about 850,000, and we're kind of like an isolated metropolitan area there at the border, and also we share a border with New Mexico. So the place is well named, El Paso, the Passage. And you can see when you're there, we have a mountain range that has its southern limit right at the downtown of the city. And then you look into Mexico, and there's another mountain range that has its northern limit at Ciudad Juarez, basically. And so it creates a place of passage that people have used since there were people passing through. They just discovered in White Sands, which is about an hour and 45 minutes from us, in New Mexico, footprints of human beings. And they just, I don't know if you read, they identified those footprints as being something like 27,000 years old. It's kind of pushed back what people used to think about when human beings first came into our continent. So it's always been a place of passage, north to south, and it's a place of passage from east to west. It gives our community a sense of identity in a certain way, as a place that welcomes people. We don't resist that movement of people. By our nature, we welcome them. And that's part of the beauty of my community. And also, it's a place in which the two cultures have met, and not to say that it's been perfect, but there's been this kind of dynamism where the two cultures meet and they blend in a certain way from the United States and from Mexico. Now we're over 80% Hispanic, but there's still that reality there. So, bringing it up to the present, we have had many people fleeing from situations, particularly in Central America. In the past, it's been more Mexico, but lately, more Central America. And really, more recently, we're seeing more Mexicans because they're fleeing from gang, narco-trafficking violence, and so on. From Central America, it's hard for us Americans to even imagine the chaos and the level of violence. It's hard for us to imagine a place where the government is so weak that the gangs really are in charge, and where they can say to this family, if you're not out of your house in 24 hours, we're going to kill all of you. And it's not just a threat, Or they can say, I want, the gang member can say, we want your 12-year-old daughter to be a gang girlfriend. And I don't need to tell you what that means. Or we want your son to be a lookout for us, when he's about the same age. Those are the things that make people pick up and say, we've got to get out of here. And it's not a matter of fleeing to another neighborhood or another town. These gangs are throughout those countries. And like, if you've heard anything about the situation in Mexico, you know that that's not an escape either. They have no place to go. But because of the reality that people have been escaping from there for decades, many of them, most of them, have relatives in the United States, and that's where they try to flee. If your house is on fire, you jump out of the window if you have to, and then you look for some place that you can stay, right? I mean, anybody would do that. That's what we see happening. So in El Paso, we have a system of shelters. There's one major organization that runs a shelter that's always going, but sometimes the flow increases, and so our churches open shelters, including the Diocese of El Paso has some facilities at our headquarters, you might say. We turned over our largest building as a shelter a couple years ago when the flow was great, and we were receiving at one point up to 1,200 people in a day. Now the flow isn't very great, because what happened during the pandemic, I could go back a little farther too, but I'm gonna try not to complicate this too much with too many details. But during the pandemic, the previous administration found exactly what they were looking for when the CDC said, you can turn anyone who is seeking asylum in your country, you can turn them away. Anybody who's trying to cross, don't ask them any questions, just say, bye, go back where you were. And that's what we've basically been doing. It's called Title 42. Even now that the spread of the virus is very much under control, even though we have tests, we can quarantine people, things like that, we're still saying to anybody, the vast majority, just go back. And so we've put border towns in Mexico under tremendous strain. They have fewer resources than we do, but they're receiving thousands of people who have fled their countries, and they get stuck in this border areas. They can't go home, they can't come across. Lately, the flow has been greater in what we call South Texas, around Brownsville and that area. It's like a 12-hour drive from El Paso, at least, maybe longer. And that's where the flow's been greater. But because we have facilities for those who are allowed to cross, and that's very often families, children, unaccompanied children. The courts have said you have to allow them to cross. And, people in some kind of obvious distress, that, thank God, a lot of times they're allowed to cross, and they're being flown to El Paso to be processed. The majority of those who are flown here, by the way, to El Paso, they're still sent across. We fly them from South Texas, they cross, and then we send them across back to Mexico. But some of them are allowed to stay, and we help them to get a night's rest, a clean shower, a new set of used clothing, and to get on to where they have people who sponsor them. What happens for them, those few who are allowed to cross, is that they're under what's called parole, and they have to appear in court wherever they go and make their case for asylum, which is also, the odds are tremendously against them. But they're willing to take that chance because they're desperate. So kind of a long answer. I hope it gives you a bit of a picture. Any others? Yes, ma'am.
This seems like such a hopeless situation that has been going on for such a long time. Are there any answers for long-term resolvement?
I think there are. But we're going to have to break out of our way of thinking about borders and about human beings and mobility. The Pope has been talking about this a lot. How many of you have checked your DNA, have had your DNA checked to find out your roots? A number of you have, right? And if we had time, it'd be interesting to ask you what you learned, but I can tell you one thing you learned, is that you have roots from all over the place, right? And sometimes there are some big surprises. Human beings move, you know? And it's not because they necessarily want to. I mean, we tend to want to stay where we are if we can, but people have needed to move through the ages. And if you trace us back far enough, you'll find our roots in Africa, right? We've come from so many places and spread throughout the world. Human beings aren't going to stop doing that just because we in our particular age decided to establish nation states with borders, right? So we've got to find a way that a nation can be, a nation's borders can be more like a cell, for instance, than like a Berlin Wall, right? A cell allows passage of nutrients, you know. It allows a flow back and waste goes out and so on. I mean, there's passage through that cell wall. And that has to be the case here. If we would see migration as something that is part of the human reality, the movement of peoples, then maybe we could begin to cooperate with it a little. And by the way, okay, so then people say, oh, he's for open borders. Just open it up and let everybody through. No, that we think there should be an orderly passage, but we should have a system that allows people who need to pass, or particularly whom we need to pass, to do so. That is not the case right now. Even people who just want to come here and go back, we don't have visas for them anymore. We have been so stuck in Washington in terms of legislation that we haven't been able to adapt to new realities and new needs. You'll see help wanted signs all over the place, right? And if you have connections with farms, with agriculture and so on, you know that that's a huge shortage right now. But we don't let people to find a legal way to pass. Something else that I think I wish people knew about migration, there are a number of things, but one is that it's self-regulating to a large measure. Because people aren't going to come here if there aren't jobs. If the jobs are full, they're not going to be here. If there's no way for them to live and make a living, they're going to look for someplace else. And that has been the case, for instance, with Mexico in the most of this first 20 years of this century. How many of you knew that migration from Mexico was actually in negative numbers during most of those 20 years? Did you know that? In other words, more people were trying to get past the darn walls that we built to go back than to come across this way. Because, why? The economy in Mexico improved. They were even willing to take some of the risks of violence to go back to the place that they call home, you know. So there is a large measure to which we regulate ourselves. Another thing is, if we really said, well, you know, we don't really want that many people coming across for whatever good reason, right? We don't want them to have to be disturbed. You know, the church says the first right of a person is to be able to stay where they are. The second right is the right to migrate if they have to. That's what church teaching. So if we really took that seriously, if we really thought beyond borders, then we'd say, well, what can we do to help these broken countries to be more stable, to stem the violence and so on, you know? And we'd be smart about it. We wouldn't just give money to corrupt dictators, which is what our country has done. We wouldn't just strengthen a military that's already a mess, and just so they can violate more human rights. We'd help at the grassroots for development in those countries, and we'd help honest brokers to rebuild a healthy nation. But unfortunately, that's not been our focus. In fact, we could point to the behavior of the United States as one of the major causes for the disorder in those countries. For the way that we've destabilized their governments by supporting coups, for instance, or by the ways that we have, and this is a big one, supplied unending funds to narco-trafficking gangs by our suicidal love for illegal drugs. Where do you think they get all their money for all their weapons? Where do they get their weapons? From the United States? We should feel a certain qualm of conscience for the struggle that they're going through there, and I think so. A big part of a new way of approaching migration would be to say, I care about my brothers and sisters in Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and I'm going to work to help their situation to be better. Yes?
So, on that point, is Catholic Relief Services doing some work in those countries?
Absolutely. Yeah, they are, and thank God for them. And of course, I have to, in full disclosure, I'm on their board. And they're awesome. They really are, it's very impressive. Did you know that the Catholic Church is the largest non-governmental aid agency in the world? We can be very proud of that. We should be very proud. And they're there. I visited with them in all of those countries of Central America, for instance. And, the U.S. government actually looks to them in when they're following their better lights to learn how we can really help. However, despite their good work, they're small compared to the kind of help that those countries need. It can only really be done at a governmental level. And so we have to get our own government to really be committed to this work. With the new administration, we were very hopeful. They really were sending out all the right signals about what we call root causes of immigration. Did some really good work. But unfortunately, here perhaps, I'll permit me to get into giving you my opinion on politics, but it does seem like they have the angel and the devil on the shoulder, right? And the angel is saying, help these people so they don't have to send someone. And that's a long-term solution, right? But the devil on the shoulder is saying, if we're getting a lot of heat because too many people are coming, then we've got to just shut it off. We've got to go to the restrictive measures of the previous administration and just close the door, and it all comes down as though it's a border issue, right? Border is just the place where they're crossing. The issues are in this country and in their countries. And we think that somehow if we just close the door, with military might. There's one politician a few years ago who commented on the border very proudly. He said, "We're going to have a border as strong as the Berlin Wall." I'm saying, really? That's a good thing? We didn't think it was so good when it was in Berlin. But anyway, that's kind of where we are. Yes?
I have a question on a different topic, and that is that in El Paso a year and a half or two ago was a mass shooting that really tore into the fabric there, and I followed that, and some really amazing movement forward. But how is that? Where is that for you now?
Thank you for asking. So, as I think you're all aware, a young man, 21 years old, from the Dallas area no less, drove 640 miles or so from his home to El Paso. In his manifesto, this was on August 3rd, 2019, and his manifesto said he was coming to kill Mexicans. And in order to create a war, to stop the invasion, as he phrased it, from the South. He was a white supremacist, and he came, parked his car and took out his assault weapon and began randomly shooting people. Within several minutes, he had executed what became 23 people. One man lived for about 8 months before he died. I knew him. And wounded another 24 or so. It was Walmart, a supercenter, right on I-10, our major thoroughfare, a place where many of our brothers and sisters from Mexico come to shop on a Saturday morning. And when he was done, he had killed about 7 Mexican nationals, but he also, killed a teenage kid, shot a 9-year-old girl, killed both the mother and the father of a 10-week-old baby who was in their arms, killed or shot and terribly wounded a young black woman whom I've come to know. It's just horrible. That Walmart is about 10 minutes or so from my house. It was, I have to pass it all the time. So what was remarkable about that whole experience was the response of El Paso. I'm so encouraged. If you ever think Christianity is just dead in the world right now, I can tell you it's not. That grace is still at work. We were the whole community was traumatized. It's a big city in many ways, and yet it feels like a really small place where everybody knows each other. Latinos are so family-oriented, so community-oriented, their response was incredible. I sat most of that day after I went to the hospital with families that were gathered in a kind of a reception center to wait and to hear about their loved one that wasn't answering the phone, right? They could suspect, but they also knew that, people were scattered, people were hiding, what have you. And I sat with a couple that were the parents of the young man, 24 years old, who was there with his wife and baby. And one of the things that the father said to me along that long afternoon was, we had heard that the young man was captured. He said, I really feel for his parents. What must they be going through right now? How is it possible for a father who thinks his son has just been killed to be concerned about the shooter's parents? And what I haven't publicly announced is this recording? Well, that's okay. But hopefully eventually that family wrote a letter to the parents expressing their concern for them. That response was echoed all over. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't hurt, tremendous hurt, and anger, tremendous anger about the violation of these people. But when we got together the next day, it happened on a Saturday. On Sunday morning, we announced that we're going to have a community time of prayer in the park that was like 2 blocks from the Walmart. And just word of mouth, basically, social media. And more than 8,000 people gathered in the park that night. And civic leaders and faith leaders led the prayers. There was not one word of what that shooter wanted, of hatred and anger and retribution. Basically, the message was, he attacked our identity, not only as people of Mexican heritage, but as a community that welcomes, a community that loves, and we are going to continue. Our answer to him will be love. I was so proud, of our community. And to me, it gives hope for all of us, So.
In addition to the pandemic of virus, there's a second pandemic, that of lies and hyperboles. And these are inciting so many people to do things that have never been heard of.
Right.
All dangerous or detrimental to people. What do you say to this, grown men that are involved in mendacity and hyperbole?
I've wondered what I would say to him. You're talking about
him.
Them. Yeah. Well, I guess I'd have to start by listening to them, as hard as that would be. And, I'd have to start by talking to them about the teachings of Jesus. I don't know. I'd have to control my anger, because I've been angry about it, trust me. But I don't know, see where the conversation led. Pray for them. Yes.
In the pastoral letter that you wrote after that tragedy, you said some things that I think, at least personally, were so important. Could you share a few of those with us.
Okay. So I did write a pastoral letter. And I talked about the reality of racism and white supremacy in our country, and I talked about the fact that it's not only towards people of African heritage, but towards people whose skin color happens to be a shade of brown. And that's primarily in our country, Latinos, no? And I talked about the history of that racism in our country. It's been, I think most of us citizens, even ones who are well informed, we have a pretty good idea, at least to some degree, of the terrible injustice we perpetrated on people of African heritage, in our country. But we're much less aware of the situation for people who have come from south of our border. And it's kind of an interesting thought experiment to think what would it be like if the inflow was more from north of our border than south, from Canada. I think it'd be different, don't you? I just tried to point out that this is a problem. One of the things that became clear to me in the aftermath of the shooting, clearer, is that white supremacy can't be just dismissed as like this fringe crazies, that it's not harmless, it's terribly harmful, and even in its, it opens the door to not only harming the sense of a person of dignity that each person merits, deserves, but that it can lead to innocent people dying, So we can't be, complacent about movements such as that in our country. And we have to recognize that language can also be extremely damaging. When a presidential candidate, for instance, says no less than 500 times during his campaign that we're facing an invasion from the South, that they're allowing rapists and criminals to come up there. If we refer to human beings as illegals, things like that, we're setting the stage for this kind of supremacist thinking that can, in fact, lead to great, great harm. If talking about illegals, if everyone who ever violated a law was called an illegal, then we'd be a nation of illegals, right? Most people don't even know that to cross a border without documents, even without sufficient reason, is not a felony. It's a misdemeanor, right? But we raised it to the level where we think it's practically a capital crime, right? And then we characterize this whole group of people as illegals. And by the way, if people have a legitimate claim to asylum, they're not even doing anything illegal. international law and our own U.S. laws permit a person to pass wherever they need to pass in order to escape into our country. You know. Do you know where those laws, by the way, came from, asylum laws? What moved our country to work internationally to allow asylum to people who are fleeing? It goes back to World War II, when a ship full of Jewish escapees from Germany arrived at our shores and were turned away. Were returned to Germany, where most of them were exterminated. You know. And that's when our country said, we don't want to do that ever again. You know. And so we helped organize the nations to recognize a right of asylum, and our national laws reflected it as well. Unfortunately, asylum laws haven't been adapted in a way to recognize the present circumstances where they envision a government that persecutes a people. They don't envision a situation where a government is weaker than another organization, like narco traffickers, and they're the ones that are doing the persecuting. It's not for religious reasons, but simply as an exercise of raw power. So our immigration, our asylum laws need to be adapted, but that too is stuck in this ridiculous gridlock that we have about immigration. I know that your time is perhaps running out, but are there any other? I'm not home.
I guess, what would you suggest that we do about this situation?
Oh, thank you. So what can you do way up here in St. Cloud, Minnesota? First and foremost, pray. Would you please pray every day for people who are struggling in those kinds of situations? Open your heart. And one thing I talk about in the pastoral letter is that we've got a dilemma. The problem isn't them. The problem is in our own hearts that are so cold that we don't even begin to want to know their plight. You know, so prayer has a way of opening hearts, right? And so as we pray for them, we're also experiencing a transformation, I hope, within ourselves. Secondly, do what you can on a political level as citizens of this country. You know, write to your legislators and help others around you to come to look at these realities in a different way. We need to, ultimately it's not a matter of changing laws as much as it's a matter of changing hearts, right? If we don't change the way people think about immigration, then no law is really going to help us a lot. One of the things I would love to see is if local communities would invite the immigrants among them to tell their story. Nothing has the power of that. I can talk to you day and night about what the church teaches on immigration. It's a beautiful teaching, right? On social justice and the like. Won't have nearly the impact as if you talk to a family that escaped their situation at home and now live among us, So I'd love to see that happen in local communities, and it would have a tremendous power. Yes.
Bishop, you talked about the role of faith leaders. I wonder, are you majority Catholic there in that community, or do you have a united front with other
Yeah, we're only about 80% of the population Catholic. But yes, we do work with other faith leaders, and yes, they share a concern about immigration. Many other churches have opened their doors to immigrants when the need was there. We have a small Muslim community, and they've been present, Sikhs and others. So, yeah, that's been very positive for us. Problem in the Catholic Church, to be honest with you, you're probably aware, and I'm not unaware, that unfortunately, while our leaders, by and large, tend to be very conscious of the issues and very concerned about immigrants. My brother bishops, we're united on this. Not every bishop knows all that much about the reality, right? Because they're not there, but their hearts are there, and I feel very tremendous support from my brother bishops, and I think most priests. But where the problem happens is at the grassroots. It's kind of sad. But as on a number of issues of church teaching, we have a hard time really bringing along the laity on these issues. So we have to keep working at that. Algo más? We've covered a good bit. So, Joan?
Let's thank Bishop Seitz for his presence here today. We just ask that you'd close us in prayer.
I was hoping you'd ask. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, open our hearts. Make them hearts of flesh, not hearts of stone. Help us to expand the limits of our love beyond whatever borders we've created, to love our spouses, to love our families, yes, but not to the exclusion of others, Lord. You are the Lord of love, and your grace shows us the way to love beyond ourselves with a love that is truly yours. Help us, Lord, to see that our faith is not just an archaic system that helps us to feel better as we walk through life, but rather one that challenges us to know you and to serve you in the midst of this world today. Please bless each one here, Lord, their families, their loved ones, especially those most in need of our prayers, and be with those who have lost their homes, their resources, their communities, their identity, as they seek to find new life for themselves and their children. And I ask your blessing upon them and upon each one here, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless you.